Hey, folks, I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind Podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performing at our best when it matters the most and applying knowledge under pressure. Now, I am really psyched for this episode. Our guest is somebody who's become a good friend of mine through a lot of the work that we've been doing together, Vinton Bruton, who is the director of the Wilson Center for Leadership in the Public Interest at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia. And in that role, he focuses on the leadership development at the undergraduate level, drawing on his expertise as a Marine infantry officer, an outdoor trip leader, a volunteer firefighter, and an educational leader. And I've gotten to know Vinton really well over the last little bit, getting a chance to drop into some of his classes, meet some of the students he's working with. Vinton, thanks for switching gears from how we normally do it, coming on the podcast and digging in with me.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you give folks a bit of a background about who you are and what you do, and that's either you or the project in the Wilson Center in general, or however you want to take that.
All right. So let's see. So I'm from North Carolina. After college, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. I did 10 years on active duty as an infantry officer, got to command a couple platoons and 3 companies, and that was a great experience. Got out after company command, went into education, and worked for almost 15 years at an all-boys college prep boarding school here in Virginia, the Blue Ridge School, which was a great experience. I love being an educator. While I was doing that, continued to serve in the reserves for a little while, commanded another company. That was fun. And went and got a master's degree at Gordon College, Master of Arts in Leadership. Probably the most important and interesting thing I did at Blue Ridge School is focus on character education and how to really help instill that in young men. Just about 18 months ago, got the job as the director of the Wilson Center here at Hampton-Sydney College. Hampton-Sydney is an all-men's college, under 1,000 students, all undergrad, very liberal arts. And the center has been around for about 20 years. The college has been around since 10 November 1775, so as long as the Marine Corps. And great job, really get to teach some classes. There's a couple of minors that we operate out of the Wilson Center. One is National Security Studies, the other is Leadership in the Public Interest, and then a lot of our work is co-curricular. It's a leadership development program that runs from freshman year all the way through senior year, just trying to get students ready to lead in whatever field they want to lead in.
Love it. Love it. And it's been an awesome and an honor to get to drop into some of those classes and work with your students and with you on a lot of these concepts about leading under pressure. They're motivated, they're interested, they want to get better, and they deeply care. And it's so cool to see.
Yeah, it's easy to get up and go to work in the morning when you've got students like that.
That's great. Yeah. So let's roll back just a little bit to the beginning here. So for folks who are listening to this that have more of a medical than a military background, you're talking about leading companies and leading platoons. What are the sizes of those in the Marine Corps? What are we looking at? What are the types of problems you're dealing with as a leader of those groups?
Yeah, so platoon is rifle platoons, I think 43 Marines. I had a mortar platoon that was larger, about 56, and you had more equipment and that kind of thing. Companies range in size from 200 to 300, depending on what kind of company it is. I had a company in the training establishment at Parris Island, South Carolina, that was recruits, so that was a larger number. And then on active duty, had a weapons company, so that's about 250 Marines divided into platoons. So yeah, so various sizes, but I think a good way to think of it is about 40 as a platoon and a couple hundred as a company.
Yeah. And obviously, there is a lot of the structure of the military that prepares somebody to lead, that gets them into the space where they can do that, and that helps you make that happen. But what was that like for you as you were taking over those assignments? And that's going from being an operator to being a leader is a common theme on this podcast and what we do in general, because that's a big transition, both in terms of how you think of yourself, but also in terms of the work that you actually do. What was that like?
Yeah, so I commissioned through Officer Candidate School, which is different than going through ROTC or a military academy. So right after college, it's like I applied for it, decided that was the challenge I was looking for, got in and went straight to Officer Candidate School, which is basically a 10-week job. It's like a job interview for 10 weeks. And That was pretty stressful. That was a hard adjustment from total civilian to Marine officer, but it was really good. It's a lot of stress. It's a lot of physical work, but maybe the most important thing is you're constantly being put in leadership positions, required to lead, and then given really direct feedback without too much regard for your feelings. And so you learn a lot. You learn a lot when it's like, all right, you're in charge for the day. And then from there, you go to the basic school, which is 6 months. All officers, all Marine officers go there, whether you're going to be a pilot or an infantry officer or anything else, lawyer, all those guys, we all go there. A lot of that is about learning the profession, everything from platoon level tactics to what's the uniform code of military justice. A lot of it's like college courses, everything from lectures to decision games to go out in the field and practice what you've learned. And again, you're rotating through jobs where you're learning the job and getting evaluated on that. From there, it was infantry officers course, which is about 3 months. That was a tough course. You spend a lot of time in the field. Again, you're doing leadership and getting
Sure.
evaluated on it and applying what you've been taught. And those lessons really stand out. Then you get a little time off, and then I went out to Camp Pendleton, California, took over a rifle platoon, which was incredible experience. But then it's every day.
Sure.
You've received about a year of training, which seems like a lot when you're going through it, and then you take over a platoon. You're 23 years old. It's a lot of young men. Everybody's
Mm,
young. I remind people of that when they think about just the age of people you're dealing with in the Marine Corps. Most of
sure.
these guys are 19, 20, 21. You got a platoon sergeant who's ancient, who might be 30. When you talk about the problems you face and solve, some of that is tactical, and then a lot of it's just personnel and dealing with
Sure.
young men. And it's a formative stage of life. So you've got a great opportunity to make a difference there.
Yeah. And I like the way you describe that as you're doing leadership, right? Sure,
Mhm.
you're going to learn some theory about it. You're going to learn some understanding of like, how do we understand human beings operate together and what are some frames and ideas you can put in place? But ultimately, you're learning by doing leadership
Mhm.
and by rotating through and by experiencing that firsthand for it. Well, where did the thread of education and maybe specifically character education, where did you pick that up in this arc?
I think it was actually before the Marines. I didn't know
Hmm.
this, but I didn't know this was what was happening in my career path. But the 2 summers before the Marine Corps, after my junior year of college, I was a raft guide. And that was a very formative experience. It was in West
Mm,
Virginia on the New River. And I got some great advice from the guy he was my uncle who owned the outfitter. And he said, "Hey, listen, this is all about know yourself, know your crew, know the river." And so that could be applied in a lot of
mm.
ways. You got
Yeah.
to know your own
Yeah.
strengths and weaknesses, and what you're capable of. There's some paths down a rapid that I wasn't good enough to do and didn't need to try as a young guide. And then you've got to real quick get to know the people in your boat and what they're capable of and what they respond to. And all this is intuitive, and you do it once or twice a day for months at a time. And then the river's different every day. So if you think you got it figured out, you're probably wrong. So I think that's a pretty good model. And then from
It's great.
there, one of the things I learned from that experience, though, one reason I didn't go back and keep doing that is that the part about that job I liked the best was spending 3 or 4 nights with the same people. Like we would get high school and middle school campers that would come out and we'd do like a longer rafting trip and spend nights out, flip the boats, sleep on the bottom of the boat. And I loved that process of building a team over days. And that has really been a
Mm,
theme for me is that's not unlike leading a platoon. It's not
sure.
unlike working in a boarding school where you get to know the students in and out of the classroom in a 24/7 environment. And it's not unlike being in college where everybody lives on campus and you see
Sure.
them outside the classroom. So
That's really cool. An interesting structure. I love that. Know yourself, know the boat, know the river. Feels like that is just really solid advice for a lot of different issues in there. Okay, so you had this idea, or you were exposed to this idea that part of operating is learning about yourself. You go through this leadership experiences, you're working on this, and then you come out and did it feel like a pivot to go from the Marine Corps to education?
yeah, that was a that was a huge pivot. I remember going home frustrated because a student had rolled his eyes at me or something like that, or didn't do what I told him to do in class. And my wife had a little talk with me and said, Marines have had a lot of training in how to be a good follower. How good a follower were you in high school? And I had to think about that and say, yeah, I cannot expect 16-year-olds to act like 21-year-old Marines. So I really needed to pivot and change the way I led in the classroom. And then even more so when I became an administrator, an assistant, and
Mm.
associate headmaster, and I'm leading faculty. That's an entirely different ballgame. So lots of pivoting. And I would also say that's just something that the subtitle of my intro to leadership class that I teach freshmen is things I wish I'd known when I was 25. And that's one of them is just that you don't get to have a leadership style. Like you're
Sure.
going to have one, but you have to adapt your leadership style to the people you're leading, to the situation you're leading in, to your mission, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
So I
Different
think
river every day.
adaptability is huge. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Okay. Okay. So thank you for that structure. One of the things I'm most interested in digging into is this idea of how do we teach character? How do we teach leadership and structure to folks who are on the younger side, right? And I think to wrap some context around this, whether we're looking at emergency medicine or we're looking at the broader universe of teams that perform under pressure, one of the themes we're seeing is that there is a concern about, and I'm using this in enormous air quotes here if you're listening to this instead of watching this, but the younger people, right? There's some sort of an idea that the folks who are coming up, who are starting in the pipeline, are different or not quite the same as the folks who are us who are older than us. There could be some truth to that. It's also probably exaggerated. And whether or not it's true, I think the question is, what do we do with it? And how do we handle that challenge? And then from a broader sense, what does excellent look like? Right? How would we really dive in and offer up the best of what we've learned about character and leadership in our lives, both our successes and failures, to this next generation of people who are coming up behind us? I think we've built some problems that they're going to have to be super active in solving. Not to abdicate us because we're in there too,
Mhm.
but we need them to be better and smarter than we are. Yeah, man, take that any way you want.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big question. First, I think it's
It is.
true, right? Like every new generation is different. And I think that goes back to Socrates got in trouble
Yeah,
for corrupting the youth of Athens when people
yeah,
were very worried about that. So it's not a new problem. It's at least 2,400 years old. And the other thing, I was actually just talking to a colleague about this, and that was a Marine thing. It was amazing what young people could do. It was
yeah.
amazing what I learned. And I was young, but thought I was old. I was 30 and watching 20 and 21-year-old corporals do incredible things. And so that always has stuck with me ever since that young people really can lead, especially at the team level. So now I'm going to borrow, if you don't mind, from I think an under author and thinker about leadership, a guy named John Adair, Adair. He's English, really started working in, I want to say post World War II, but before 1970. I want to say like 50s and 60s. But his thesis, if I could boil it down, was that you really got to start young to learn to lead. You should start as young as you can. He worried that 22 was too late, which I don't think is right, but like he really thought 16 to 18. And he said, teach them to learn to lead teams. Like they don't need to try to learn to be CEOs or government officials or generals or anything like that at late teens, early 20s. They need to learn to lead teams and give them as many opportunities to lead teams as possible. And so I guess that's my answer. And then I think what's fun, it's something again that I learned as a high school teacher is teaching and leadership are about relationships. And I have answers that worked for me over the past however many years. Those may or may not be relevant to the next generation. I have to earn the right to share those in a meaningful way. They have to trust me. But mostly, I think both character and leadership, I don't want to say they can't be taught, but I think they are primarily learned. So it's all about like designing opportunities for young people to learn. So I think more like for me, I think of my job more as designing opportunities and opportunities to reflect, opportunities to succeed and fail, and then think about why and do that in a way that is meaningful, memorable, psychologically safe, You got to be able to make mistakes. And I think good things happen when you do that.
So, how does that map into? And again, we're going to use emergency medicine here as a
Mm-hmm.
vehicle, not as a be all and end all, because I think this applies
Mm-hmm.
to fire and military and everybody else that we work with. But okay, so there are times in emergency medicine where it is very safe to practice things and to fail and to grow. And it's in a large part why we have sim as an idea, right? We
Mm-hmm.
create an opportunity where it's a mannequin. And
Mm-hmm.
if you kill the mannequin, that's okay. We just bring the mannequin back to life and try again versus on a real human being. But somewhere in there, you cross this gap where there are real life consequences to your actions. And I think we see some folks who really struggle to get the concepts, lead the teams, do the work in the sim environment, even. And then we see a bunch of folks who can nail it when the pressure's off, but when it's real life stakes, something else happens and they can't quite hit that next level of it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you map that to what you're saying? Because I love this idea of designing chances for them to learn.
Yeah. So I think one way you do it, and this riffs off of one of your ideas in Emergency Mind about, I think you call it the wedge, where you
Mm-hmm.
start with low stakes and you get greater and greater stakes, greater levels of difficulty. I think of it, the way I apply that is at the kind of lowest stakes, lowest immersion, you've got something like a tactical decision game where an immersion's a big thing for me. Like you really gotta, and that's the art of it. And I'm not always successful at it, but create an environment where they feel like they are leading and it matters. And on the skinny end of the wedge, I've got tactical decision games where you're asking them to immerse themselves in a scenario for anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, maybe. And then a level up from that, one of my colleagues is really excellent at that. At this one, it's called, I think of it as a decision forcing case. So different than a case study that's retroactive. This would be more put you in a scenario, ask you a series of questions that might last an hour, an entire class period where you're playing the role of a leader. Bruce Gudmundson is the man's name that I'm thinking about here that's so good at this. A level up from that, I would say, is leadership reaction course. I'm really excited. We've just had one built here at Hampden-Sydney, but that's something that the military uses a lot to assess leaders, but I think it can be also used well to teach leadership and reflect on it. So if you can imagine an obstacle that's designed for a team to negotiate and in a limited amount of time with limited resources, you put someone in charge, give them the information, and they have to come up with a solution. There's probably dozens of possible right solutions, many more possible wrong solutions, but it's not a puzzle where they're trying to find the one right answer. And so in that environment, they might be 5 feet off the ground. It's not a high ropes course, but they really are telling real people what to do, not imaginary people. They are watching their plan not work and having to adapt it to their personnel and their own strengths and weaknesses and the situation. And I'd say if you've got a 50% success rate, that's almost perfect because you've got guys that are successful and then you guys that got guys that fail. And yet staying with the wedge, maybe on a similar level, there's some great board games out there that you can really engage people's imagination. And as a professor, if I create the right stakes where it's a quiz grade, or if you beat this other team, you don't have to write the paper or something like that, gets a
Yeah,
good level. Anything competitive
that's
tends
great.
to bring that out. And then I'm almost done with the wedge analogy. To me, the best stuff happens the deeper and longer you immerse as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
the more you get out of it. Recently, so last summer, we went out to Idaho for 10 days in the Sawtooth Range with a group of 10 students for a class we called Expeditionary Leadership. And they rotated through, they would spend 24 hours as the leader of the day, 24 as the medic, and 24 as the assistant leader. And so this gets back to your question about medicine. I think what's hard is isolating for leadership, like
Sure.
isolating for the mindset and the actions, but I was really happy watching students do that and then debrief each other. And we would create a medical emergency scenario in the backcountry where they had to, solve problems and rescue people. And it was safe, but it was very challenging. The terrain was real. They didn't need a lot of imagination because they were hiking up a real hill with a real stretcher to deal with a great actor who was me, pretending to be hypothermic or whatever. And I was really happy. One of the students, after the first day, and he had a tough first day as leader of the day, the group got split up. He had to solve all these problems. And he said, you know what I think helped with that was doing tactical decision games. I wasn't sure I bought into that earlier in the year, but I think those helped my mindset. I was like, all right, good. That anecdotally, that seems to work. That's great.
That's awesome.
But I do think that just one of the things I love about your work is it allows me some insight. I'm not an expert in anything. I'd say I'm a generalist. I've got a little bit of experience in a few different fields that I think might be relevant to your audience. But I think the mindset that makes someone successful in a high stakes environment, especially where time is short, is probably pretty similar to in an emergency room or a fire ground or in all sorts of tactical scenarios. So I think we're aiming for the same outcomes and ability to think under pressure and adapt.
Yeah, there's that sense of, like you said at the beginning, leadership is doing, right? And to learn it requires being out in those spaces and doing some work. Although you can, and I use being out in those spaces loosely, right? Like you can do it on a trip, you can do it in a sim center, you can also do it in micro in all of the different decisions that you're making over the course of a shift, or the way that you're interfacing with your folks, the challenges you're presenting to them. And I think having the tools in place to make meaning out of those environments and those circumstances is really important as well. What about the character piece of it? What does that even mean?
So I think that's maybe harder than leadership. They're closely related, right? They're one of the things I really like our Office of Student Affairs here focuses on. They call it character refinement. Okay, by 18, you have a character when you show up in college, and now it's a matter of making it better and refining it. And so this might be a long answer, but I'm really influenced by a guy named Kurt Hahn, who some people know as the founder of Outward Bound School. I learned about him in graduate school, and I had heard about him just in outdoor networks, and I assumed he was like a German version of Paul Bunyan or Daniel Boone or something. Nothing, he is nothing like that. He was very much an academic. He founded a couple of boarding schools, but he is all about the concept of transferability. So, as an example, like where Outward Bound School came from as a concept, Kurt Hahn had fled Germany, came to England, started a boarding school in the late 30s, 1930s. And when World War II started, one of his students' dads owned a merchant marine or some sort of merchant liner, cargo ships and stuff, and said, okay, our problem is, just in conversation with Kurt Hahn, he said, our problem is when one of our ships is hit by a German torpedo, we're losing sailors days after the ship sinks. They're out at sea. And oftentimes it's the young guys that physically should be able to handle it, but can't. And the old salts seem to survive, which kind of gets back to your original question about young people, generational things like that. And so Kurt started working on, okay, what can we do to mentally train people to not yield to those circumstances? And so he came up with, all right, it's not safe to go train them. The goal isn't to be technically better sailors. The goal is to be more mentally resilient. And so he came up with what is now the Outward Bound School and its process of, okay, let's go into a novel, uncertain environment that you haven't been in before, often with strangers, and teach you to be confident that you can overcome those things. And then that will transfer over to if, God forbid, you find yourself in a life raft. I know this is a long answer to your question, but I did through an organization called the International Boys School Coalition. I did an action research project when I worked at the high school level. And I was really interested in Angela Duckworth's concept of grit, right?
Sure.
And how do you make students more gritty? And one way I tried to do it initially was we read and watched The Lord of the Rings and talked about, I've been a literature teacher too, and talked about grit and how important it was. And basically, the long and short of it is I effectively convinced them that grit is good and they could recognize it, but their own scores on how gritty they were went down. And so maybe it was just by comparison. And so I decided, then I ran into Kurt Hahn and decided, all right, what I got to do with our character ed program is get these young men out to do things that are hard and force them to be gritty. And that seemed to work. That we created a whole project where students went out. Sometimes it was community service with Habitat for Humanity. Sometimes it was setting long-term goals and visiting colleges. Sometimes it was we did a big senior trip where they hiked up big hills as a team, solved problems, really got out there and did things beyond their comfort zone, with the idea being, okay, like that's what college is. New environment, new comfort zone blown, got to find a new one. And you can do this because you've done it before. So I think, to your question, I think both character and leadership, there's got to be an experiential element. It's not enough to have good ideas in your head. You've got to have an opportunity to show that you can live up to those principles and your own kind of highest ideals. So I think the art of education in that is creating appropriate level challenges that increase and that students experience some failure along the way so they can reflect and then do it again in an even harder environment and do it better. So
I'm struck by the Seneca quote, right? A gem is polished by friction, and so a human is polished by their trials. I'm recently back to jiu-jitsu after a long time off for injuries. And there's this thing that happens when you don't do jiu-jitsu for a while and then you go back to jiu-jitsu, which is that you end up skinning everything, your toes and your fingers and your forehead and everything else, because your body is not used to it again. So it's that I'm in the middle of that process right now. And it's interesting to think about that idea that like you are really purposefully creating friction in these lives in order to help people understand like what to do with it. I think that's such a powerful thing. I feel really grateful having been exposed to that from the martial arts as a kid, hard things and frictionful things. And I probably could have gotten away without getting punched in the head quite so many times, but there's some sense of you have to be put in hard situations in order to figure out what's happening from it. So I want to draw a line here between a couple concepts we've been talking about. So there's the concept of character, who you are, how you handle hard things, what is your relationship with that to yourself and to a lesser extent to your team. There's this concept of leadership, which is relational. How are you with part of a group, and how are you part of a team, and how are you guiding folks? And there's this other concept that we haven't named yet, but that that is in here in all of this, which is the concept of culture, who we are and what we do. And you mentioned it at the beginning when you were like, yeah, this one student rolled their eyes at me, like, comma, and that would never happen in the Marines, right? Because that's not how you did it there. And there's this thing I've been seeing and having experienced too, which is that there are sometimes differences in the culture of folks who are part of a team and who are coming onto a team. And those culture differences are sometimes mistaken for or construed as character differences, right? Who runs the Mission Critical Team Institute that I'm part of talks about, we were supporting a particular team for selection and assessment, and one of the instructor cadre was mildly irritated that one of the candidates had referred to him as dude. And Preston's comment, which I think was quite important, is, did you tell him how to refer to you? Are we teaching people the culture, the how to do the things before we expect them to get it? And are we misconstruing cultural differences as character differences? I've been on the side of this too. We had a student come in at some point who was dressed in a way that I would certainly not have dressed for the work I was doing. And my immediate instinct was, wow, this person's not going to be able to handle what we're about to do. And it was a very snap judgment based on that culture piece substituting for a character piece. Now I'm going to also say, though, that a character trait is being able to see the culture around you and being able to absorb yourself into it for a higher purpose, right? So when I came into the emergency department, I had to learn the emergency culture. They didn't have to learn Dan's culture, right? I had to become part of them because that was a higher and better purpose than what I was up to. But I wonder if part of the issue that we're having from a generational standpoint is a culture piece as opposed to a character piece. I don't know. What do you see that as?
Yeah, it's a huge question.
just little things, right?
Yeah. Things that immediately come to mind was one, I think just recognizing that might be the case is really important, right? And I think I'm trying to remember the Mark Twain quote, but he says something along the lines of travel is a great cure for ignorance. He might even
Yeah,
say
sure.
travel is a great cure for racism. I forget exactly how he puts it, but it's just like knowing that there are cultural differences that may need to be accounted for is really important. That was actually, I was thinking that was a blessing of my Marine Corps service is getting to go to a lot of different countries and see, okay, people do things differently, but we can still work alongside each other. And you mentioning the assessment piece, even within the military, you've got hugely different cultures between, from the outside, it might all look the same, but you've got a major cultural difference between different organizations. So I think part of it is just recognizing that
Mm,
I don't have the answer to it, that's for sure. And I deal with mainly 18, 19, and up to 22-year-olds. So that's a different culture than
sure.
mine. But I think giving people the benefit of the doubt's important. To your point about has this guy been told, hey, don't call him dude? I think that has to happen. But part of me says, hey, culture is almost this set of unwritten, unspoken norms, which makes it hard, right? It's not that you shouldn't have to tell someone, hey, don't call that guy dude. They should be able to figure it out. But on the other hand, I don't know, it's a tough one. People,
Yeah. I mean, I think, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead. I was just going to say culture's complicated.
Culture is complicated. And I think we're seeing across domains the rise of much more cognitively diverse teams than we were
Hmm.
seeing before. Much more, in a positive sense, diversity and backgrounds and like training sets and different ideas that are approaching problems together. And those teams have the potential to go much farther than teams that are more monoculture. But there is that sense of, hey, like certainly when I was coming up, there was a sense you should just figure this out. And if you don't figure it out, then you're not going to make it. And that might or might not be true to the same degree. I guess I'm wondering from a leadership perspective, are we're certainly at risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we get rid of or downgrade folks who don't have the same understandings and top level cultural pieces. And I don't mean culture here as a proxy for race or gender or
Right.
any ethnicity or preference. I literally just mean how do we do the things that we do? And
Hmm.
how do we talk to each other in certain circumstances? And how do we interact like that? And a
Hmm.
lot of that, maybe more than what I used to think, has to be taught and has to
Hmm.
have the ability to be learned, like we're talking about for
Hmm.
character and leadership. And
Hmm.
I don't exactly know how to draw the shape between those dots, but I think that there's something in there with the background question being how do we do better by our youth? Because I think that we are struggling to arm them with the right tools, tactics, and sense of self. And we're starting to see some of the ripples of that. And we need to do better as a culture for that culture, big C, as opposed to
Hmm.
little c culture.
And I think two things came to mind there. And one is symbols, which I can come back to. And the other is just intergenerational relationships. I think most young people are willing to learn and want to find people they admire. And we, as the elder, have to make that possible and manage that relationship. And I'm guessing it probably looks like, and this gets back to symbols, I think. I'm actually rereading a book, How Great Leaders Think. And this gets back to mental models, which is one of my favorite concepts that I think we share. But
Sure.
they say, hey, there's four frames that Bowman and Deal, who wrote this book, think are important. And it's structural, human resources, symbolic, and political. And the symbolic one focuses on, hey, these are ways to demonstrate, show, hey, this is what we're really about as an organization. And that symbol could be
Sure.
a uniform or a way of dressing, or it could be a way that we talk to each other. And I think sometimes making that explicit is important. Like saying, hey, the reason why, I'll give you an example. My daughter is a senior in high school, so she's looking at colleges, and one of the colleges in the classroom, everyone refers to each other as Mr. or Miss, and then last name from the
Hmm.
professor to the youngest person in the room. And that's symbolic that, hey, we are all on a search for wisdom and truth together. Nobody has all the answers, and we're really respectful of each other because we are going to need to disagree and test each other's ideas. And I just think that's such a the difference in calling someone by their first name and Mr. Bruton can be very insignificant, but it says a lot in that college classroom. So I think, and they explain it. Here's why we do it.
Yep.
So I think that the symbolic frame and then the explanation and then the consistency maybe is at least part of the answer there.
I think that's spot on. I think that component of it, that we're going to do this on purpose and here's why. And now we'll do it this way. And that's, I think, part of the piece that has to be in there. And the piece that I see a lot of teams struggling with is to set that up in a way that makes sense and that feels like a scaffold and not a cage for the folks that are in it and that are doing it. I think you're right. I think that I hate to make a generalization about society, but as a society, we have moved away in a lot of ways from ritual and from tradition and are now more into sort of self-discovery and understanding. And one of the risks with that is that we don't have those scaffold pieces that help us figure out where we're going and what we're doing. And the teams that I've worked with, and these are super high performing teams who are tackling emerging problem sets, complex adaptive systems and everything else, they're still struggling to have those conversations. This is how we will talk to each other into this moment. And we're going to do it this way because of this. And to the extent that they can make that unspoken, in medicine, we often call it the hidden curriculum, the stuff that we expect you to know but don't teach for some reason. To the extent that we can make that hidden curriculum visible and approach it and agree on it, then we have an understanding, when Vinton and Dan are in a crisis that looks like this, here's how they will talk to each other, here's how they'll act, and here's why. Then those teams can really start revving it up, even when they come from incredibly diverse backgrounds with different training sets and everything else. Even when they're a swarm team, when they're coming together and don't know each other, that's one of the, I think, really key ingredients to making effective teams under those circumstances.
Yeah, the community, I'm jotting down notes as we talk. I love the phrase scaffold, not a cage, because you want people to be able to be creative problem solvers. And so if they feel like they're in a cage, they're not going to do that. And the hidden curriculum is something that I've talked a lot about in various educational circles, right? There's what you say is important, and then there's what's actually your actions say are important. And yeah, and then the swarm team piece, I'm always blown away by that because I think that looks so hard. I've seen a little bit of that on things like being a volunteer firefighter and a bunch of different people from different organizations show up to solve a gnarly problem, and it's really hard. So I'm in awe of emergency medicine who does that routinely. But the other thing you said that I thought was interesting, just about the communication piece is so hard. I think I've still got enough muscle memory left over from the Marines that I can take a lot of hard criticism in the moment in no uncertain terms and don't take it personally. But that's not the norm most places. But I would think around an operating table or in the cockpit of an airplane or places like that, you don't have a lot of time for please and thank you. You got to do that later.
Yeah, it's a really
so how do you? I think the question is, how do you make that a norm where people know, all right, this is what communication's like in this zone. It doesn't. After the fact, we won't take it personally.
So I was just in Philadelphia running a project with Children's Hospital Philly and their neonatology team. Brilliant folks, right? Hard problem sets. You're talking about resuscitating babies. This is like ultra challenging, incredible life or death scenarios. And they have a lot of stuff. They're just like, they're brilliant and excellent. One of the problem sets we were working on, and this is by no means unique to them, this is something in a lot of medicine, is that we do understand when we're in the middle of a crisis that we're going to talk to each other differently than we're going to talk to each other when we're just walking in the street. One of the issues is, what if not everybody on the team agrees in what scenario we're in? So if some of the people feel like, hey, this is just an average day, and some of the people feel like, no, this is a life or death crisis, you're going to get a mismatch of communication in there. And that's not because one set of people is right and the other set of people is ignorant. It's literally just somebody might have seen something coming around the corner that the rest of the group hasn't seen yet, right? There's only one person that sees the fire coming first, or whatever the right metaphor is there. How do you spin a team up so that everybody understands that they're working on the same problem? And in medicine, one thing we have is the code blue button, right? So you hit that button, a code blue alarm goes off, and that takes everybody's attention to this one point in time and space, right? That is a way that the organism of a hospital can refocus its priorities and resources dynamically to solve a particular problem. When you come into that, it's pretty clear, hey, we're in this moment and we should be talking to each other in a way that respects that. And there are a lot of things we do and say differently in those moments. You hand me a thing and I'm like, no, not that tool, the other tool, to borrow from Preston again on this. That's not because I'm saying you're a terrible human being, you have screwed this up. I'm just saying, no, I need the other thing. Okay, let's keep going. There are times when that wouldn't work in normal conversation. So having everybody on the same page is pretty critically important about that. And then you wrap that back through these layers of what we've been talking about, where maybe you and I come from different training sets and our version of what a crisis is looks different from each other. So how are we gonna have the meta conversation ahead of time about when should we switch to A versus switch to B? We did, when I was training in emergency medicine, we did EMS radio control. So we got a little bit of briefing on how to do radio etiquette, just the basics of it. But it would be enough that you'd then understand, oh, we agree ahead of time on how to talk to each other so that we are better able to transmit information in degraded, contested, or challenging conditions. But if you don't have that conversation ahead of time, then you're running the risk of things going haywire. And I think when we blur away from medicine and blur into, say, business or nonprofit world or whatever else it is, a lot of those teams aren't having those conversations, right? They don't know how to have how will we talk to each other when this light goes off conversation, which is a pretty key component of it.
Yeah, I think a whole lot of things came to mind in that. And I don't know how you solve this in swarm teams. I think I do know how you solve it in intact teams. And I think it starts with realistic training so that you get used to hearing each other. It's okay, this is a simulated emergency, but Dan's going to speak to me in a different tone of voice than he does when we're deciding where to go out to eat. And then I think the other part is just honest debriefs, which I think are this art that very few organizations do well. And people are allowed to ask the hard questions. And again, I think you do that best in a training environment where you're saying, hey, why did that go sideways? And leaders take responsibility and say, yeah, that was my mistake. And I think that goes a long way at the macro level. And I love your prepare, perform, recover, evolve framework. And I think at the macro level, one of my favorite units I was in, it was when I was a brand new second lieutenant, but our battalion commander was a guy named John Holden. And we held things called kangaroo courts about once a month for officers only. And it was exactly what it sounds like. It's a court. And you could charge people with crimes and they would have to answer for that. And it was all in poetic verse. You had to give your charge in the form of a poem and you had to do your response. So there was a lot of thinking on your feet. And it was a way to not air grievances, but go back to hard moments that in retrospect were funny and remind people, oh yeah, now it's funny, like no hard feelings. And I think at the macro level, that was brilliant. That was brilliant for morale. It was, okay, Bruton got yelled at for this, but that was 2 weeks ago and now we can laugh about it. So it created this environment where you could be serious, but then there were times where it's like, all right, bygones are bygones, let's move forward.
It's awesome. I love that idea. Yeah.
I would also say, and this is like back to mental models, one of my favorites, I might get my year wrong. I think it was 1973, Tannenbaum and Schmidt, Harvard Business Review made this, it's called Continuum of Leadership Behavior, and it's authority on one side of the spectrum and freedom for subordinates on the other. And a high authority communication and decision making is exactly what you would expect. It's giving orders and expecting them to be adhered to. And on the other end is very much more participatory and delegating. And something that I talk to my students about is you don't have the luxury as a leader of picking, hey, this is my style. I like to be here. It's like a bag of golf clubs. You need to be able to hit them all. Like you need to be wise enough to know, all right, in this situation, I need to be on the left hand of this continuum, or I need to be on the right hand. And so I think that can be helpful just in, let's say everybody in the organization has that mental model, and it's a nice image that's easy to ingrain in your mind. And in the debrief, you can say, yeah, I went way left on that. And here's why I did. Here's why I was communicating that way, because I felt like we were in a crisis. And so I think that could be helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to dig into thinking through how to apply that. I can't believe this, but our time is actually like at the end here, which is pretty wild. I feel like we just got started in this. It's how our conversations usually go. As we end this, I want to leave you with a chance to give a challenge to folks listening to this. And I'm going to let you think about that for a second while I do our disclaimer here, which is that our job here on the Emergency Mind podcast is to take the best of what people have figured out about applying under pressure and spread it widely. We don't provide medical advice, and our views, both my views and the views of any of my guests, are our views alone and don't represent that of any of the organizations that we work for or with. We're just out here trying to do the best we can to bring cool stuff out to the world. So with that, Vinton, you want to bring us to the end here, and what's your challenge for people?
I have two challenges. The first is I think leaders have a responsibility to have brutally honest debriefs, and they've got to, I didn't do this well for a long time. I think I'm getting better at it, but say, hey, here's mistakes I made. Because I think that lets other people than you from saying, hey, okay, he's willing to admit his mistakes. Very rarely do we get to actually hide mistakes from people following us. They see it, so you might as well own it. And I think that lets us get better as teams. And then my other challenge, it's going to read, I would say, read anything by C.S. Forrester, especially the Horatio Hornblower series, because I think it's enough out of the ballpark of any of our normal. It's set in the Napoleonic Wars. It's a British naval officer, but he goes through a lot of trials and tribulations and learns things the hard way and is a very good leader. And I think it's enough out of most people's experience that it doesn't sting, but it's relevant. And that's my little literary plug.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And more than that, thank you for what you're doing with the folks you're training to tackle some of these big challenges of character education and to help us figure this out. So deeply appreciated.
Thanks for having me. Working with young people is a lot of fun and it's a privilege. Thanks for helping me with that when you zoom into my class and through your work.
Absolutely.